Okay, I'm going to go ahead and start. So thank you everyone for joining this webinar on God mobility data, leveraging data to inform impactful policy outcomes. I'm Sebastian Castellanos with NUMO, the New Urban Mobility Alliance. And the idea for today is to run attendees through our new tool, Micromobility and Your City. And just give you a few examples of how mobility data can support the goal of cities, and some of the goals that we have identified that cities are trying to pursue and will continue pursuing with new mobility modes. Today we have a packed agenda, so we're gonna go ahead and start. We have a very interesting group of people that are joining us from very diverse sectors. First of all, we have Fernanda Rivera from Mexico City. So Fernanda is the Director of Road Safety and Sustainable Urban Mobility Systems. And Fernanda has been an integral part of the work that we have been doing for the past 6 months that led to the launch of this tool that we are going to showcase today. We also have Josh Johnson from SPIN. Josh is the Public Policy Manager for SPIN, and he has been overseeing some of SPIN's data sharing practices and everything related to governance, innovation, and privacy for SPIN. We also have Rachel Zack. Rachel is Policy Director at Remix. And Rachel has a ton of experience in everything related to data and policy and shared mobility and autonomous vehicles. So Rachel has also been collaborating with us very closely on this tool. And finally, we have Russ Brooks, Principal of Scale Consulting. And Russ really has been the arms and legs of this project, really shepherding this as a senior advisor to NUMO. So we're very happy to have everyone here, and thank you for everyone that has joined so far. So we're going to go ahead and start with the webinar. I'm just going to hand it off to Rachel. Rachel is going to give us a bit of context of why a tool like this one is important, and just kick us off into the rest of the webinar. So Rachel, if you're ready.
Yes, awesome. Thank you. And thanks for that intro. Can everyone see my screen? Great. So yeah, that was fantastic. I'm Rachel Zack. I'm the Policy Director at Remix. And this is a topic that is very important to me. My career has been mostly in government before joining Remix, but always focused on sort of innovation in transportation. And so mobility data is really a core component of innovation. So it's a topic that's near and dear to me. And we did come on as a partner for this project, and that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about, as much as talk a bit about why this tool is important in the upcoming 6 to 12 months. So Remix works with 350 cities to understand, plan, and collaborate on their mobility futures. And I named this presentation Measuring Outcomes That Matter, because that's really what this tool is all about. And it's something that Remix is laser focused on. So a little bit of what we do. So Remix is a platform that helps cities quickly gain insights about where scooters are being distributed and how to plan networks that support their needs in pandemic. That might be looking at health centers, like in this image, and then drawing a network that quickly pulls up the demographics that you'd be serving, as well as sketching what that quick build might look like. So I want to also point out that this project, this tool that you're going to see, and Russ is going to give us this sort of orientation with, was really a product of 50+ experts across the globe. I have the US written there, but this was really a global group. And what we did was come up with use cases for mobility data, and then work our way back to defining the metrics and then identifying the data sources that could get us there. And that process, that second process, is really the part that Remix kind of dug in on. And the reason why we wanted to do this is it's very much in line with our goals, which is really democratizing access for all to figure out how to create more livable cities. And creating more livable cities is really the mission of Remix. So this is a survey that we deployed in June, and what you can see is that the comments really show that what cities care about right now is mobility needs, such as getting people to affordable housing, to and from affordable housing, getting them to grocery stores, to medical facilities, that crowding on transit is an issue, and demand for short trips is on the rise. In LA, what we're seeing is after initial drastic decline, citywide vehicle trip making is on the rise. And that this issue of how people are moving is one that has an equity component to it, that is not the same across races and incomes. And so we might actually need to focus on our most vulnerable population. And what the exciting part for this topic specifically is that a lot of cities are thinking about how micromobility can play a role in serving some of those needs. And this is just an image from Muni's, San Francisco Muni's recovery plan that points out that in some of the early phases here, bike share and scooter share are an integral piece of solving some of those needs that I called out from the Remix survey earlier, of getting people to and from a lot of those short but critical trips. So let's talk about the tool. And Russ will go into this in more detail, but I think what I'd like to impart on you is that there are 100 different metrics. That's not because we think you should use all of them, but because we wanted you to have access to a slew of options to pick the most important for your city. So you'll want to determine your goals, select the best metric, monitor the results, and this one's important, work with your providers to better understand discrepancies in your data and maybe theirs. It's really great to have both quantitative and qualitative understanding of what's going on the street. Nothing's ever quite super clear. And then 4, think holistically and lean in. When you're looking at a certain type of mobility, know that it's one piece in a greater puzzle. And so you always want to have that context. And I would just go back to that 3rd point to really work with your provider to understand what's going on and how to fix it. And finally, I just wanted to thank all of the collaborators rolling up the screen here, because this was really a process that we came in to solve sort of midway through. We were in there for all the use cases, but it was really, really a huge process. And a big thanks to Russ Brooks for running the entire thing as well. And with that, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Rachel. That was great. So now we are going to go over to Fernanda, Rivera, and Josh Johnson, who, as Rachel just alluded to, they were integral parts of the work that led us to the tool. Just to give people a bit of an insight on how that process went, we started in September of last year with a group of around 20 people that were representative of cities, of micromobility operators, and of data management companies. And the group slowly expanded to include new voices. And we ended up with over 50 people from very diverse backgrounds. And we really led a process of trying to reach a consensus and trying to reach understanding between the companies that are producing this data, the cities that will eventually use the data, and some of these other stakeholders that are interested in things like privacy and things like how to actually use the data. So Josh, even though he's right now with Spin during the process, he was with the city of Minneapolis. So Josh, I think, has a couple of different hats through the process. So it'll be interesting to hear from him. And Fernanda, again, was representing the Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico City. And, knowing that Mexico City has a very advanced permitting structure and a very good understanding of how to manage some of the data that these companies are producing. So I'll just hand it over to you, Fernanda. You can tell us a bit about, how the process went from your side and some of the things that you think are useful from the tool itself and how you envisage using it in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Sebastian, and thank you for the invitation for being part of this group. I think that it was really amazing to share the Latin American experience of making a regulation to these new mobility devices that we can see now in our cities. It has been really interesting because I think that we have the best of the technology because we as city planners have the data of how people is moving, how they are making their trips, what are the principal streets that they're using. And that's really helpful when you have to plan a city. But also we have the risk to ask too much information to the companies and also to do not know what to do with that information. That's the biggest issue that we have to deal with. And the second thing that as cities we have to deal with is how we regulate. We just copy a regulation of any other city, or we implement a regulation that is ad hoc of what is going on in our current context, in our current situation in every city. I think that what we have worked in the last, I don't know, maybe year, it's really useful not only for the cities that are new markets for the companies, but also for the cities that have been working with the companies and have developed regulations, because it keeps changing. I think that the market of the dockless systems, the scooters, the bicycles have changed from 1 year before to today. We have seen companies that appear, companies that disappear, technology that changes, and having all this information in one useful platform, it's really good for city planners because now you know what you have to measure, what data is important depending on your context. Are you going to focus on environment? You're going to focus on equity. You decide what you have to prioritize. What we have done in Mexico City is also really interesting because we have all the information, obviously anonymous information of the total trips, but we have seen how the patterns of trips have changed in the city, and we're building cycling infrastructure that is relating to these patterns of trips that we have in the city with the money that the companies paid to get a permit the last year. So we have this successful combination that with the data that is important, we're getting also the infrastructure that is useful for this type of users. We're currently going to start a new process to have these scooters here in Mexico City. So hopefully it will be successful. And I'm sure that we're going to use all the platforms and all the different indicators and the metrics that we have discussed in the last year. So I just have to say congratulations for all the effort. And I think that is not only useful for new cities, but it's useful for the cities that we have already have some experience on the operation and regulation. So thank you for the invitation and thank you for sharing with the whole world.
Excellent. Thank you, Fernanda. That was great. And thank you for being a participant in this process. As you said, your Latin American perspective was very useful in this process, and seeing how some of these companies are really expanding globally. Getting those different perspectives is very, very useful. I think you alluded to something also that I found very interesting, which is cities actually obviously have a real need of data. And something that I have come to realize while working with some of these companies, and Josh, please, I'll give the word to you in a minute, is that micromobility companies are actually very open to sharing data with cities. And I think just bringing both perspectives together was something useful from the group, because we were able to see how the goals of both companies and cities actually align in many of these topics. So Josh, perhaps I'll hand it off to you, and you can tell us a bit about your experience again with the group, and now in your new role, how you see this tool might be useful to you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Yeah, so having a unique role working with the city of Minneapolis in kind of the development of the use cases, and then switching to Spin, kind of working on the back end in finalizing the use cases, but then also working through the metrics and the data sources. I've really valued the experience, and I think what I find most useful or valuable about the tool is that it really does well to connect and reconcile data with policy. And as micromobility has kind of entrenched itself as a prominent piece of almost every city where it exists, their new mobility efforts. And then as data has also become kind of a core tenet of those programs, it's incredibly important to have this kind of solid ground for a city to stand on to not only understand how it wants to use data, how to develop policy accordingly, but also how to evaluate and monitor compliance with whatever it is, whether it's equity and access, sustainability, safety. We share all of those goals, SPIN as a private operator, and we have it in our partnership promise that we want to share data proactively with cities, but we also want to make sure that we're being mindful of privacy and doing everything we can to protect user privacy. And a core piece of that is making sure that we're collecting data for a useful person, or we're sharing data with a city is collecting data for a useful purpose. I think as cities were reacting to micromobility in 2018 and early on in 2019, there wasn't much eye for developing use cases and making a clear connection to policy. It was really, as Fernanda kind of alluded to, copy and paste, for lack of a better term, from those who experienced scooters and micromobility first. But as 2019 progressed and into 2020, I was guilty of this with the city of Minneapolis too, just trying to work my way through use cases, and not really having a proactive approach to it. But I think cities have certainly shifted, and this tool is going to be incredibly helpful in continuing to help facilitate that effort to allow cities to be more proactive, to make sure that there's an eye towards not only you have an outcome, you have a use case of data that might evaluate that outcome, but then you have a connection to how to measure against that outcome. Very basic things like vehicle availability. There hasn't been a lot of common ground previously on how vehicle availability may be measured, and I think every city has that as a core piece of compliance of their program, but there may not have been prior to cities starting to really be proactive, a whole lot of thought or effort put into understanding how they actually want to calculate that, or how they want to monitor compliance, and that's true of a number of things, and all of these use cases and the metrics associated with them help to kind of make sure that cities can be mindful of those things as they're developing policy, not in reaction to policy that may have already been developed. So I think that's what's important to me, is that also puts us on common ground as an operator with the city. So it's not necessarily this kind of push and pull with a city when it comes to development of policy or reaction to agreements that cities may be implementing, but rather we can start from kind of common ground, given that this is not only developed with a balanced approach between public and private sector, but also the goals, the objectives, the use cases that are included here are shared among us as operators and with cities. So I think it's incredibly valuable, and I'm excited to see how it continues to gain adoption and reflect in city policy going forward.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. I think one of the things you just mentioned that really always strikes me when people mention this is that the scooters they did come kind of like unexpectedly for people, and I think this is something that we'll continue seeing with other technologies, right? So being able to have something a common ground between people, as you were saying, that come from both sectors on what are the goals and what are some of the use cases, that data, regardless of the new technological advance that comes, will help everyone. So with that, and we'll have more time to talk to you and Fernanda a bit later, but I want to hand it over to Russ right now. Russ is going to give us a bit of an overview of the tool for the people that don't yet know about it or haven't used it yet. And we're just going to run through a couple of use cases to really showcase what the tool can do for cities, for companies, and really for anyone that is trying to better understand what is up with new mobility and data. So over to you, Russ.
All right, thank you, Sebastian. So I just wanted to take a minute just to walk through both the kind of the working group and how we approach things, and also obviously the result of that work, and specifically walk through the website and its different sections. So, as Rachel mentioned and as Josh mentioned, the goal for the working group was really to help develop a set of use cases for cities and companies. And so, you know, the goals were both to be really specific about what those goals really specific about what those uses for data can be for cities and operators, begin to create some standardization between those two entities so that they are looking at things in the same way more frequently and more consistently, and also really about transparency and being able to for others, for the public, for advocates, for everyone really to be able to get a better sense of what's happening as these new modes are really being introduced in our communities. The working group, as I think Rachel said, was about 65 different participants from the public sector, from the private sector, companies like Remix and other data managers and aggregators and analyzers, and you know, advocates and other local community organizations. So it was really a broad group. And the idea is really to start with, what we did was start with kind of broad, higher level categories. So we wanted to focus on the things that both cities and companies and advocates often speak to as goals for these services. And I should also say that we really started with micromobility. This is solely focused on micromobility to begin with, scooters, dockless, and bike share. But we think a lot in here obviously applies to other modes and can easily be transitioned, but we wanted to start in a really kind of definable way that would allow us to kind of set a process, and then we could use it later to apply to other things. So so what you'll see is solely focused on micromobility and the data that companies are providing and cities are collecting, and how they're using it. Really long-term goal was to focus on those higher level outcomes that both cities and companies often state is their goal when introducing or permitting these services. For the group, this really came down to 3 core areas, which was equity, safety, and environment, and felt like everything that we came up with fit under those 3 categories, with the exception of general usage, which we created as a 4th area. So how, where, and who is using these services, but really everything here is focused on equity, safety, and the environment. And so the page and the website and the tool all drives from there, because you know, as Josh had said, and others certainly say, it's really important that as we start introducing new services, that we are focused on outcomes, that we are focused on what our goals are for these services and how we think they can benefit our communities. Often, you know, in the past, often cities and local governments have started with the technology and then figured out a use case for that technology. And the goal here, by putting outcomes really up front, was the idea of starting with the outcomes so that we can directly tie new services and new vehicle form factors and other things directly into those outcomes from the get-go, and really try to maximize their potential from the outset. And as Josh said, then directly connect that to policy. So if you scroll down the first page, what you'll see is a list of really all of the use cases. So as I went up above equity, environment, and safety, as you start to come down a little bit further in the site, you'll see that we have broken out each one of those higher level outcomes into kind of subcategories. And these subcategories are what we call policy levers. So we thought, or the group thinks, that these are the areas that cities have the ability to affect change around these services. So we have broken them down into their sub levers. You know, for equity, for example, it's access to necessities, access to platforms, and access to vehicles. And you'll notice under each one of those, we've created a kind of a goal statement. So for access to platforms, for example, the way that we define that is increase the ability for all users, especially those in underserved communities, to get timely and accurate information, afford and easily access and understand how to use micromobility services. So the goal for us was to define them so people and really people who take advantage of this tool can understand what we mean by access to platforms. But I think it's really critical that, you know, as Rachel had said, that cities need to make these definitions their own. They need to, and certainly Fernanda had said this as well, they need to personalize this. So this is for us a place for cities and others to get a starting spot. So I'm going to click on access to necessities, and for us, access to necessities is to increase access, convenience, and reliability to fundamental daily necessities that improve social mobility and a quality of life, especially for underserved communities. This card is right here, but one of the things that I want to point out real quick is the ability to sort by that high-level outcome that you're particularly interested in. So you'll only see the cards that say apply to equity. I'll switch over here to safety, for example, and you'll see the card switch. So those policy levers that are directly related to the top level outcome will appear. So I'll go back to equity, and then I'll click on this first card here on the left, the access to necessities. So again, each page ties it, as you can see, to an equity outcome, and then has a definition of what we mean by access to necessities. And then underneath here, you'll see a hyperlink, and the hyperlink actually will click down into these questions. And so these are what the group decided on as being really the key questions under access to necessities. And that's how we've then organized each of the policy levers, because if your community is concerned about access to necessities, we felt these are the questions that are most pressing that you're going to want to answer. Does this service increase access to necessities in the community? Is it being used to increase access to necessities in the community? How is this service integrating into the transit network? And then are there more new trips added in underserved neighborhoods? So we have decided through a broad whittling process, as it were, that these were really the top priority questions that we felt that cities and others might have, cities and companies might have. But this is by no means exhaustive. These are just the ones that we felt were the priorities. And again, from a process standpoint, cities will have to see if they relate to these questions. Cities and companies will have to see if they relate to these questions, or if they have an alternative question that's particularly pressing in their community at the time that their leadership or their department is specifically focused on, or the council or members of the community. So it really does need to be tailored down. But if you click on any one of these use cases, what you'll see then, what you'll see underneath it is a set of evaluation metrics. And so we've broken things up in a number of different ways in order to respond to this question. So if your department or your company feels like this is a high priority, is this service being used to increase access to necessities in the community? Here are 3 evaluation metrics that we feel speak to that question. Trip case use answers, survey answers, the percentage of trips that start and end at education, healthcare, grocery store, or other community necessities, or trips originating and terminating in underserved areas that's been normalized by both the total trips and the total trips per 10,000 people. And so that is the way that the tabs work, is to provide a set of evaluation metrics, which is the primary measure of the broad question that is being asked. Additionally, and I'll come back to this in a second, but additionally, we've created more tabs for other specific areas that are important. So if a tab exists under another area, whether it be policy or equity or compliance, it will automatically populate there, and you can click over and see for those questions, what is the equity question that is associated with that? And so I will just say, and I'll come back to it, but the group wanted to take a special focus on equity, certainly with everything that's been going on across the country for the last few months. But given that our working group was really last year, we wanted to make sure that every question and every metric that we proposed, we put through an equity lens. Not every question, not every metric has an equity angle, but many do. And so you will see that on a tab here. So for example, the comparison of survey answers in underserved area versus the total service area, or on that other metric, the comparison of the percentage of trips that start or end at these community necessities in underserved areas versus total service areas. So, you know, we're seeing a lot of change in how micromobility is being used due to COVID-19. This is a really good example to see how that is shifting, not just citywide, but also shifting in specific neighborhoods to get an understanding of whether or not these are becoming more essential in underserved neighborhoods than they are in say, wealthier neighborhoods. So we've tried to include those here. Under each one of these metrics, what you'll see is view data required. So that allows us to jump directly to back to the data or to a data and sources page, which I can go through again in a little bit. But it specifically tells you the pieces of data are necessary in order to calculate that result. So here is a big chunk, for example, of the work that Rachel and the team at Remix did was breaking down each of these individual questions and each one of these individual metrics into their related data sources. So for example, for how many trips are starting and ending at necessities, you need the route start, you need the route end from MDS, you need service area spatial files, you need the locations of healthcare, grocery stores, government facilities, educational facilities, and jobs. So these are all pieces of data that should be publicly available or available to a city or a company, certainly, as they're providing that data. So we've done that here with really every piece of data to allow people to get a very concrete sense of what is required in order to answer the question, or excuse me, to inform the metrics of the percentage of trips that start and end at these community necessities in order to answer the question of, is this service being used to increase access to necessities in the community? So that's a good example of a kind of a work through. I'm going to walk through one or two more, but I also wanted to point out that, you know, to say the difference between question 1 and question 2 was the desire for us. You know, question 1 is, does it have the potential really to increase access? And the second is it being used to increase access? And so those were two different questions that we got a lot of interest in, but the difference between potential and actual, you'll see reflected throughout the metrics, because it is important, you know, to invest in modes and services that have the potential to create access, but it's also really important to know if people are actually using it for those outcomes in their personal lives. So we've tried to do our best to include both of those. So I'm going to switch over to another one here, access to vehicles, just to give you another sense of some of the other tabs that we have here. So access to vehicles, again, the definition is anyone, anywhere can find and access an available micromobility vehicle within an X minute walk. X is because cities need to determine that for themselves. We had a lot of discussion of should it be a 5-minute walk or a 15-minute walk, and then we settled on cities need to determine their own outcomes for themselves. So you'll see a couple of the metrics or a couple of the questions that reflect that there is some local variability that'll be necessary. So if we go down to the second question, where were vehicles sought unsuccessfully? So we have a set of evaluation metrics here that's really about the number of unfulfilled trips. But maybe your city actually has, the screen keeps shifting, I apologize for that. Maybe your city has a specific policy around vehicle distribution. So we've included that as an example policy here that a lot of cities have started to integrate into their permits. And then the metrics for that policy would be the percentage change in the number of unfulfilled trips. And so that gets you part of the way to the question, but then the real question may be the equity question, which is the comparison of the number of unfulfilled trips in underserved areas versus the total service area. So we've tried to include that as well. What you'll see, I'm going to switch over here because it's got a notation. How far does the average user have to travel? So in a number of places, we wanted to call out the need to combine metrics. So in a couple of places where you'll see this one, for example, the distribution coverage, and you'll notice a formula here, and that formula is taken from SFMTA in San Francisco and their distribution formula. But note that underneath, cities should consider coupling this metric with the number of unfulfilled trips per neighborhood for a more accurate reflection of how vehicle coverage is working for end users. So where there is a notation to combine it, or if there is a qualification to the metric or the data that's being used, we've done our best to notate that here. So when a question has an evaluation metric, a policy metric, and an equity metric, you'll see that reflected in a number of different tabs. The tabs will populate automatically if there is one. So for example, again, you can click on the view data required. It will take you back here. It will tell you very specifically what you need for each piece of data to calculate this and what the source is for that data. As you can see, the majority of this can be calculated with MDS data if you can add in both a service area spatial file and a neighborhood spatial file. So last but not least, I'll take you over to infrastructure. You know, one of the discussions we had around infrastructure was whether or not infrastructure and planning was worthy, I guess, of its own category and should be a call out. But what we realized after a lot of debate was that infrastructure should be a safety-based outcome. And so that is why we've included infrastructure under safety, because our goal for that is to create dedicated protected spaces for micromobility and active transportation use, and ensure parking ensuring safety for both pedestrians and riders of all ages and abilities. And so I think that's a really good example of, you know, we had lots of different proposals or people in the group pitching that we should focus on this sub-outcome or that sub-outcome, and really did our best to kind of roll them up into those three main categories of equity, safety, and environment, because we felt like if we're talking from an outcome-based starting point, then that really should be the goal for something like infrastructure. It should be about protecting riders and pedestrians paramount. So I'll jump down here just to take another look at another use case here, which is when there is a crash, where are they occurring? So we've created a number of different evaluation metrics here. You can see this is probably one of the longest that we have. Crashes disaggregated by top locations, by time of day, by the contributing factor of the crash, by the severity of the crash, whether or not it occurred on or off active transportation facilities, what is the percentage of crashes on street centerline miles with marked bike lanes or facilities, and then lastly, disaggregated by facility type. So rolling all of these together, we felt like gives you a really good sense of where crashes are happening, which then obviously speaks to the question up above, which is where is new infrastructure necessary to increase safety? And then again, each one of these has equity questions, because I think there's a real question about whether or not crashes are occurring on different facility types or more often no facility types in underserved neighborhoods. I think it's really important for cities to understand the equity angle to a lot of these different metrics. So we've tried to really include that. Again, I will go back out to the data and sources pages, and you can see all of the data that is required in order to answer that one specific question. So just I will scroll back up here to the data and sources, the broad page, which you can find up in the top menu. And really it is a list. What we've included there is all of the use cases that we have here. So you can see all of them, including say general usage down there. How many questions, the number in parentheses there is how many questions are underneath each one of those use cases. You can sort by which question if you want to jump right into it. All of the questions have been preloaded in here. And then lastly, you can look at all of the different metrics as well. So if you know what you're looking for, you can come right in and take a look directly at this metric and click on it, and it will bring up the necessary data. And then last but certainly not least, you can also just sort. I have to go back to all metrics here. You can sort by, say, any, what are all the different use cases that come from using city open data? And so you can see all the different pieces here that come from that particular source. That is, I think, the tool kind of in, in a snapshot. I just want to say, Rachel had said this as well. There are a ton of a ton of metrics here, as you can see, by this drop-down menu here. We have over 60 questions under those 12 use cases and under those 3 broad outcomes. And we have 144 different metrics here. As Rachel said, it's really important for cities to determine what's most important for them. We don't have an expectation that any city would have the time or the resources to go and use all of these. But we wanted to make sure that this tool was comprehensive from the get-go, and so that if you were, laser focused on access to vehicles, that you had a suite of metrics to help you gauge progress to or from your outcomes and your goals. So it's really incumbent upon cities to take that into account and think about what are the outcomes that are the most important for them, that have been clearly laid out in their guiding documents, and how they can really use those outcomes to drive micromobility and other new services to be a contributor and really help them get there. So with that, I will turn it back over to you, Sebastian. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Russ. That was very, very helpful. So yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, there is a ton of information here, and we try to be as comprehensive as possible. But obviously, we'll take people a few tries to really understand how they are going to get to the information they actually need. So we're going to start the Q&A session right now. Unfortunately, Fernanda had to step out for a minute. She had a last-minute meeting, but we're going to go ahead with the rest of the panelists here on the Q&A session. So we have some very interesting questions that people have started to ask, but if you have any additional questions, please feel free to add them to the question section here at GoToMeeting. So I'm going to go ahead and start with a question that I think is, to you, Russ, and I can support you in answering that question. But there is a question here regarding the broad goals of equity, safety, and environment. The question specifically asks about, is increased access or mobility not a goal that you were trying to pursue? So I'm just going to hand it over to you, and you can explain a bit of how we reached perhaps those goals and how we were trying to portray increased access as the goal.
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. So I think, as a matter of pure organization and really kind of common shared outcomes, I think there is a real question that, not a real question that, say, cities and operators both believe in equity, right? But I think the group felt it was incumbent upon them to dive down a little bit deeper and understand not just that their goals were equity, but also that the specific equity goal may differ across, say, operators, or it may differ across specific communities. Certainly, given complex nature as both a topic and an outcome, but also there were questions about whether or not it was appropriate for us to include those things that weren't necessarily under a city or an operator's control to affect change. That's where the policy lever section really comes in. And actually, I will say, for that one specifically, our policy levers under equity really relied a lot upon the work that Rachel had done in her micromobility brief last year that we used as a starting space, because we felt that those were areas that cities both had expressed and operators had expressed interest in, that they were already beginning to regulate, but also that they actually had the ability to affect change on, so that they could, say, pass a policy that would allow, say, access to vehicles or access to platforms because they were operational in nature and therefore could create zones or distribution requirements or other things like that. So you'll see in a couple other areas, like environment as one, for example, that there was a lot of question about whether or not it was appropriate for cities to regulate some things that weren't, say, local impacts. And so that's why the environment outcomes are really focused on local environmental impacts, as opposed to see, the issue that we're learning more and more about with micromobility every day is that more of the environmental impact is upstream, but a city doesn't have the ability, or some would question the legal ability to regulate those upstream concerns. So that's why we try to stay as local as possible.
Great, thanks.
Yeah,
another very good.
Don't mind.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to tag on that that's right. We have a micromobility policy brief at the Remix website to look at specifically about expanding access with micromobility, but also say that there are a couple different access questions or use cases that came up that are also addressed in the tool. And one of the things from Remix's perspective on micromobility, but also just multimodality, is that, transit serves a lot of people and gets you pretty far, but we've also run isochrones in our platform to show that, in fact, transit's competitiveness with, for instance, drive alone, there are a lot of gaps in between where transit can get you, and it is almost counterintuitive sometimes that you can, transit is competitive with cars here and then here, but in between it's not, because in fact you'd have to walk back between those two stops. And for instance, in terms of expanding access, I think that's where, we start to see it be really interesting to also compare micromobility trips and see if in fact those areas kind of change if you were to increase the network with a small vehicle dynamic system. And so I think actually this tool starts to help you take, maybe more traditional tools like an isochrone that's been applied to transit and start thinking about, okay, and if we were to overlay how these devices are moving and those sort of gaps in the system, how do we have a more robust multimodal system that's maybe achieving our VMT reduction targets?
Excellent. Thanks, Rachel. We have another very good question from the audience, and I think this one would be more directed to Josh and Rachel. So the question here is, as shared use mobility services expand to smaller communities, these communities have the unique challenge of, of dealing with mobility data. So do you have any ideas of how these smaller communities can, have these conversations, and what type of guidance should they be following when, not every city is New York or Los Angeles. So, how can these smaller communities deal with some of these questions and grapple with, the demands of the data world?
I'll let you take that, Josh, starting with, I'm really curious how many small cities Spin operates in.
Good question. I guess I'm not sure what exactly we would consider small, but I think, just generally, this question isn't necessarily for small cities. Big cities have capacity issues, technical, gaps, and a need for additional resources as well. I was lucky when I was with the city of Minneapolis to find some very smart people who were enterprise-wide resources to help us build a really strong data platform for mobility data. But as I've experienced with Spin, there's a lot of cities who just don't have that same capacity or the same resources and tools available to them. And so I think that's where people like Rachel and platforms like Remix can play a really strong role in helping cities to ingest data in a way that's safe and protective of privacy, but also includes visualizations and outputs, which can really make it easy for city staff who may not have that technical expertise to develop insights and formulate policy from them. And so I think that data aggregator role is a very valuable piece in kind of that conversation. I'll also say, as an operator, we're willing to work with cities to help provide them with insights directly. We've done that, small and large cities, not necessarily as the core platform that they're using to analyze the service, but to answer specific questions, to gain specific insights, particularly as we've done some analysis pre and post COVID. That's something that we're happy to do. We have some capacity to do so, and we've also partnered with aggregators as well to kind of provide that as a resource for cities from day one as they launch programs. So I think that's the value that an operator or a third party can provide for those cities, small or large.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would say, or my opinion is similar, which is that, I would give the same response to a small or large city, which is like, do you have you, looked at the SOC 2 process? Have you a privacy policy in place? And have you done something similar than that maybe a private company working with mobility data would do to protect that data? And it's highly, that is a very, detailed process worth at least advancing towards, I would say, given this time that we're in. Just having some level of sophistication would, no matter what size your agency is. And I want to be clear, I think there's a lot of sophistication at agencies in terms of data, but maybe I think we're all learning about data privacy, and my cat's going to make an appearance in a second here, but I think we're all learning about data privacy. We all have to get hip to this really fast because it's morphing, and the legal terms of what's going on with it is also morphing really quickly. And so developing some in-house understanding of the risks that your agency wants to take, I think, is like the first starting step. And as Josh mentioned, there are plenty of alternatives to kind of to make sure you can get to those key metrics that are talking about success. And one of the reasons people like platforms as aggregators is simply because they would like a third party looking at and working with the providers to be saying apples to apples. And that's a perfectly valid thing to want. But if your city has one provider and you have a great relationship with them, you might decide that you want to go directly with that provider and the dashboards that they provide. So I would just say that, if you're a small city and you think that mobility data is a key component to, achieving your mobility goals, that there's a lot of alternatives to necessarily working on that data in-house.
Great, thanks guys. There's actually another question that's slightly related to this. I think this one, is open to anyone that would like to answer it. But the question relates to the sources of data. So, the part that Remix really led. And the question relates to MDS. So, the question is asking about, MDS is really not the only way you can get some of these data. And the both of you just alluded to that, there are cases when you can actually go directly to the operator to ask for some of these data. So if you can give us a bit of a sense of, why MDS, and is there any possibility to expand that so we're not like closing it to just MDS? And again, I think, perhaps both hearing from you, Jack and Rachel, Josh and Rachel would be good, because I think you both have, perspective of when MDS is useful, when MDS is not useful, and, what other sources we could think of.
Yeah, I'm really curious, Josh, what your opinion is, but I think what we're talking about is really like standards in general are useful to both the providers and third parties. We don't want to, provide data in a certain format here or there, but there is another option, which is like, if you're a city, you can do what you've always done and run surveys to your users. You can go out and do counts, and some of the metrics that Russ and I worked on really required actually like city departments going out with speed guns or and collecting data in alternative ways. So I would say that, MDS is a standard that is being worked on. that it definitely is not perfect, and it has caused a lot of stress both for aggregators and for providers, and we mostly focus on those pain points. But it was also the first sort of publicly shared standard for mobility data, and that it also provided a unified way for, you know, Josh and I to talk to each other, and for us to show those visualizations, but also for me to talk to Josh, me to talk to Bird, and me to talk to, and all have the same understanding of what we're saying. Now that process was not easy, and it's, as I say, still evolving. So I just want to decouple, like, sure, there are other ways to get data, and you're probably more familiar with the other ways than I am with MDS, because I've been, you know, heads down on MDS for a while now. But, you know, you can turn to any other way that you would get data on certain mobility users in the past, as at an organization such as a transit agency, and, you know, you can find alternative ways to do it. I think MDS is unique in its standardized format of comparing multiple, you know, if you wanted to know how different providers, for instance, compare to one another, you know, you'd want a standardized way to look at that. You'd want to, or look at them all together and see across the system. You know, if you want to see anything device related, so like, okay, you know, it was dropped off by a station, and then I also want to know it by time. You know, like, these are the questions that you can start answering with MDS. And I think, you know, well, I'll stop there, and I'll get Josh's hot takes.
Thanks, Rachel. Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with what you said. If you look at the tool and the data sources included, it's not solely MDS or, you know, fields that are comprised in MDS. There are a number of other sources that insights can be gained from, and, you know, it's very likely that those alternative sources, we shouldn't be deriving insights, you know, and combining those data sources all in one stream, essentially. So, like, connecting demographic survey data with trip data. We don't want to be able to identify an individual user or their characteristics in that way. And so we want to make sure that we're still able to gather insights and connect the two data sources, but, you know, still maintain that separation, ensuring, you know, privacy protected, that are not, you know, at risk of re-identifying individuals, or, you know, any characteristics of them that may not be tied to that use case specifically. And so I think that's, you know, something to be mindful of. There are, you know, two main specifications, as Rachel said, MDS mobility data specification, and then GBFS general bike share feed specification, which is kind of legacy and is more intended for outward facing applications. But then there's things like 3-in-1 complaint data, 3-in-1 data that a city may be collecting, complaint data that an operator may get directly from, you know, their customer service team. You know, crash data, of course, is a piece of that, and that could come from multiple places. Survey data, as was mentioned previously, and you know, some of the more observational type data, I guess, you know, cities have started building, you know, some platforms. We did this in Minneapolis for, like, real world observation of parking and riding behavior. And, you know, that comes outside of MDS or GBFS or, you know, any of those specifications as they currently exist today. So that's kind of the landscape. And I think the tool does a good job of delineating those things. So I would say, yeah, reference the sources included in the tool, and that can give you a pretty solid understanding of what's available to you.
Yeah, and I would just add in that, you know, Josh is right, but I want to be clear that MDS data is data that's coming from the operator. The question implies maybe that it is not actually coming from the operator, but it is directly coming. But as Josh had said before, any city can actually request data directly from an operator, and they could request it in a different format. I mean, a lot of this started with Excel spreadsheets and things like that. So, you know, MDS is a tool for standardization and the transmittal of data from an operator to an agency. GBFS works in a very similar way. But I also wanted to say that there was a concern in the group around not and having this tool not just be request an aggregated outcome from an operator. It was about getting raw data from an operator to be able so that the city can make the analysis themselves. cities can request aggregated data and say, just give me all the trips that happened last month, or give me, they can request, and as both Rachel and Joss have said, if they need to communicate directly with the provider, but there have been some trust issues with some providers in the past, and there was a desire in the group to have as much, or to break this down into as many of the kind of bits and bytes or the raw pieces that were necessary. But there are definitely other ways that cities can go about getting this if they don't have the capacity or the capability to analyze some of this data. Minneapolis built their own tool. Rachel works for a great company that builds great tools. There are other companies that do it, but then you can also just work directly with the provider and say, here are the things that we care about, just report us those things at the end of the month or whatever frequency you want.
Yeah, and both of you brought up a good point that I just want to re-stress, which is that MDS will not collect any demographic information, no information on the user. And so a lot of questions that cities have are really about like who is using this, about adoption, about making sure, for instance, that low income people are using are getting access to the app. And that might mean actually the app itself, that outreach is happening where it was said to be happening. And those are not things that you would get through MDS. It's really device information only. So I just think that's an important point to make there too. And so you'll see
one of 13 sources of data that Rachel and the team put together in this tool. So it's only a partial piece of it as well.
Great. I love that you put together that 13 pieces of data talking points. Perfect.
Okay, you guys, we're at time right now. So thank you to the three of you and Fernanda. She had to leave, but thank you also to Fernanda. Thank you for being part of this panel. I think it's be a very interesting discussion that we hope we can continue. But thank you to everyone who stuck with us until time. And feel free to open up the tool and send us any questions you might have.